Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the world of Peter Gotti, the man who carried the weight of a family empire built in shadows. Known as the Reluctant Don, Peter wasn't born into power. It was a burden he inherited when loyalty and blood left him no choice. As you close your eyes, imagine the dim streets of New York where every whisper held a secret, and every silence carried the weight of legacy. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. And also, like this video, your support motivates us to keep bringing you these timeless stories. Now breathe deep, and let the echoes of the empire lull you to sleep. The 15th of October 1939, the Bronx, New York City. Peter Arthur Gotti entered a world of narrow hallways, busy stoops, and a family that measured love in effort rather than words. A cold autumn light touched the windows, the city already loud with trucks, vendors, and the rumble of trains that stitched neighborhoods together. His last name would one day fill headlines. But in that first season, it meant rent due at the end of the month, church on Sundays, cousins everywhere, and a mother who stretched groceries to the limit. The Bronx taught timing, respect, and the cost of a loose tongue. It also taught the comfort of kin, the power of a shared meal, and the steady beat of work before dawn. He grew up the eldest son among brothers who would each carry their own share of the family story. The apartment smelled of sauce on weekends, of laundry hung to dry, of coffee brewing before the sun came up. Space was tight, money tighter, but there was pride in getting by without asking for favors. Street corners turned into classrooms. You learned who to greet, who to avoid, and when to keep your eyes on the ground. Teachers noticed a quiet, watchful kid who did not seek the front row. Books took a back seat to survival, and before long he leaned toward the city's labor instead of a diploma. Work came early and stayed. New York needed people who could show up in all weather, so he took a job that promised a paycheck and a clock to punch, the Department of Sanitation. The shifts were brutal, the schedule unforgiving. He lifted, hauled, and kept moving even when wind cut through layers. The crews valued reliability above everything. You arrived on time. You finished your route. You didn't complain. That culture shaped him. He spoke little, carried his load, and kept the same even expression whether the day was easy or hard. Fit for the background, he preferred it that way. The last name, however, carried its own gravity. As his younger brother John began to climb in the underworld's ranks, eyes followed anyone linked by blood. In a city where neighborhood lines mapped onto alliances and rivalries, family ties meant opportunity and risk at once. Peter kept his municipal job, but he also took on family tasks that sat outside the law. At first, these looked like harmless favors. A ride to a meeting, a sealed envelope dropped at a diner, a call made from a payphone 2 blocks away from home. He learned the signs of surveillance-parked vans with fogged windows, strangers who lingered too long, cameras that appeared after a high-profile arrest. Caution became habit. Through the late 1,970 seconds and into the 1,980 seconds, John's ascent sped up. The Gambino Crime Family, already a pillar of New York's organized rackets, shifted under new leadership. John embraced the spotlight, while others preferred quiet corridors. Peter stepped closer, moving from relative to aide. He drove his brother, acted as a bodyguard when crowds gathered, delivered messages that needed a trusted hand. Law enforcement would later say that during those years he moved from being a helpful brother to a fully initiated member of the criminal organization, eventually taking on the responsibilities of a captain and, later, a caretaker with reach across crews. The details of his induction stayed inside closed rooms, but the changes around him were obvious. The circle of men who greeted him grew, and his errands became central to keeping revenue steady. Money arrived from sources that had long supported the enterprise. Illegal gambling delivered cash day after day. Numbers, games, sports wagering, card clubs run out of back rooms. Loan operations extended short-term money at heavy interest to people who had nowhere else to go. Businesses at risk of disruption, small distributors, trucking outfits, construction firms were told they could keep operations smooth by cooperating. These weren't loud scenes with raised voices in crowded rooms. They were conversations held near loading docks, in booths by the window, or during quiet drives. The pressure was clear without anyone stating it directly. Pay, and things go smoothly. Resist, and small problems begin to multiply. The waterfront mattered a great deal. New York's ports handled vast flows of goods. Unions, shipping companies, and stevedoring firms had to coordinate. Where coordination is required, leverage exists. Prosecutors later said Peter and those aligned with him exercised that leverage, steering which companies received work, which vendors earned contracts, and which union members got the best slots. Payments followed, described as consulting fees, labor peace agreements, or simply the cost of doing business. To those involved, it looked like tradition. To the government, it was extortion woven into the city's commerce. While the brother in charge met the press with tailored suits and quick quips, Peter kept his jacket plain and his voice low. He listened more than he spoke. That style fit the role he took on: coordinator, fixer, the person you saw when money went missing or a crew took too long to turn in receipts. He was rarely the loudest person at a table, but he had the authority to settle disputes among associates who overlapped in territory or responsibility. You called him when a bookie held back, when a borrower dodged a meeting, when a contractor hinted about switching allegiances. He tracked the flows, gave instructions, and kept a log in his head because paper trailed straight into court. Everything shifted in 1992 when John received a life sentence after a widely watched federal trial. That verdict rippled through every corner of the enterprise. The federal racketeering statute, designed to link separate acts into a single continuing crime, had become the government's hammer, and the nail it hit most often was the top of each family's hierarchy. With John locked away, those on the street needed someone to ensure the machinery kept running. Messages left prison through trusted couriers. Some days instructions moved through John's son, some days through Peter, who committed them to memory and used careful phrasing to avoid handing prosecutors a ready-made exhibit. During those years, Peter's responsibilities expanded. He checked on gambling operations in Queens and Brooklyn, kept tabs on loan collectors working in Manhattan, and dealt with the sensitive waterfront accounts where everyone expected their share to arrive precisely on time. He preferred routine over theatrics. Meetings took place in coffee shops rather than clubs. Conversations were short, focused on numbers, schedules, and which problems needed immediate attention. He urged caution, especially with phones that might be tapped and rooms that might hold hidden microphones. It was an age of surveillance, and he adapted by focusing on essentials. As indictments thinned the ranks, law enforcement began to describe him as a stabilizing figure, first a senior lieutenant, then a coordinator who acted on behalf of leaders tied up with cases. When John's son faced charges in the late 1992, the need for an experienced hand increased. Pressure from federal and state investigations never let up. Prosecutors studied contractors, union officials, truckers, and managers at port terminals, piecing together a picture of influence stretching across industries. Under that scrutiny, keeping the family solvent required patience and discipline. Peter valued both. His demeanor no flash, steady tone. Early mornings helped him avoid the one thing that had wrecked others: unnecessary attention. Still, attention arrived. The last name drew it, as did the company he kept. Investigators built cases by flipping insiders who knew how cash moved and who gave the orders. They traced envelopes dropped at diners, recorded calls in which coded words stood in for debts and deliveries, and mapped who met whom after each holiday. The picture that emerged in affidavits and indictments showed Peter directing gambling crews, greenlighting high-interest loans, and ensuring businesses under the enterprise's influence paid without delay. These were not isolated events. According to the government, they formed a pattern spanning years. One strand of that pattern involved the docks. Another involved laborers in construction and related trades. Hiring lists could be shuffled, deliveries slowed, paperwork stalled. Those were levers that channeled money toward friendly vendors. Even film shoots and big stage productions could feel that push when they needed trucks, carpenters, or access to locations on tight schedules. The fees that arrived after such conversations often wore a respectable label. Yet, in the government's telling, the substance lay beneath the labels. Payment secured by implicit pressure, a classic tool of organized crime. The clampdown that followed John's conviction put Peter under an even tighter lens. Agents collected license plate numbers outside restaurants in Bensonhurst and Howard Beach. They photographed meetings in Staten Island parking lots. They listened to calls on payphones thought to be safe. Each small piece seemed mundane. Together, they supported the claim that Peter, by then a veteran of both city work and criminal management, had become the person who made sure the enterprise did not collapse, while the famous face of the family served time. At the turn of the millennium, those observations culminated in grand jury activity that pulled him into the center of major cases. Law enforcement argued he had risen to acting head and then to leader in his own right after his brother's death in 2002. That label carried weight in headlines and in sentencing memos. With it came exposure to charges that covered a broad set of wrongdoing, conducting an ongoing criminal enterprise, gathering unlawful profits from wagering, enforcing repayment of harsh loans, laundering proceeds through intermediaries and shell firms, and pressing union officials and business owners to cooperate. One allegation, especially, stood apart because of the name attached to it. Prosecutors said he approved efforts to locate a former underboss who had testified for the government and moved far from New York under a new identity. Even though no harm came to that witness, the law treats an agreement and steps toward carrying it out as a serious crime in itself. That count would become a central feature of later trials. It added a stark edge to a portrait otherwise dominated by money, logistics, and influence applied to commerce. Through it all, his public posture barely changed. He remained the man who kept his voice low, who sized up a room before sitting, who believed habit could shield him from the glare that had scorched others. But habit could not blunt a strategy that prosecutors had refined over decades. The RICO framework allowed them to gather small acts in envelope here. A call there into a single narrative of enterprise. Once that narrative reached court, jurors heard from bookies who described collections, from business owners who testified about payments they felt pressured to make, from union members who explained how hiring lists bent toward certain names. They listened to recordings where everyday language hinted at finances that never reached a ledger. That is the arc from a birth in the Bronx to a man seated at defense tables with years of conduct laid out before him. The city shaped him, its grind, its loyalties, its unwritten codes. The family name opened doors inside neighborhoods and drew scrutiny from everywhere else. He made choices that tied him to rackets that predated him by generations, then took on duties that, in the government's view, placed him at the top when others fell. Before juries returned verdicts or judges set terms, the story had already become one of labor turned into leverage, of quiet errands turning into command, of a life that began on a crowded block in 1939 and moved, step by step, toward rooms where every sentence was recorded and every decision weighed by law. Before sunrise, he would step into a Staten Island diner with a cap pulled low, a chipped mug set in front of him before he asked, the doorbell still jingling. Outside, a sedan idled with the heat on, glass fogged, a figure reading a newspaper that never turned a page. He scanned the room like a man who had spent years learning what mattered, who sat where, who whispered too long at the counter, which payphone across the street had a new scratch on its metal. He wasn't there for show. He was there because money moved in the dark and questions piled up in daylight. Calls came from bookmakers wondering about a bettor who'd gone cold, from a trucker worried about loads sitting too long at a pier, from someone in a union office asking if a name should move up a list. He kept those threads in his head, tying knots as needed, cutting lines when they got tangled. The city yawned awake beyond the glass. He took a sip, left cash near the plate, and stepped back into air that smelled like salt and diesel. When his brother's verdict landed in 1992, the center of gravity in the family shifted. The courthouse lights dimmed, but the enterprise did not stop. John was moved from one secure facility to another, and the traffic of visitors became a ritual. Peter joined that rhythm. Trips to see him meant reminders whispered over a plastic table, words chosen to stay inside the room even if someone tried to pull them out later. Prison rules required patience. Lines stretched, guards watched faces, and each visit felt like a clock ticking louder than it should. He carried messages both ways: what men on the street were doing, what needed to be adjusted, which disputes required a neutral hand. He wasn't the most feared person in the family. He was the reliable one. The younger brother who had stepped up after John's incarceration, John A., drew heat of his own at the end of the decade. With him under indictment, and later in federal custody, the need for a steady manager grew sharper. People inside and outside the FBI began to say Peter was handling day-with-day operations, first as a stand-in, later as the person in charge when calls had to be answered quickly. It wasn't a coronation. It was a burden taken on, because the name demanded it, and because the machine that drove money through illegal channels needed constant attention. He did not reinvent anything. He kept existing parts turning, wagering, high-interest loans, arrangements at the waterfront, and in jobs where a slow morning could cripple a week's schedule. Gambling money flowed from storefronts and apartments where small groups placed bets on sports, horses, and numbers. Cash came in neat stacks from runners, then broke apart into envelopes that went up the line. The work required calibration. Bookmakers needed protection from heavy winners and guidance on how much risk to carry. Collectors needed schedules. Everyone needed to know who settled what and when. Late payments drew a visit. Chronic lateness brought a visit from someone senior. That senior figure, more and more often, was Peter. He didn't raise his voice. He made expectations clear, and then expected results. The loan business required a different touch. A person who came for money at a dangerous interest understood the rules going in. Deadlines could be extended for a fee, but the balance had to be respected. Skips happened. Some borrowers moved apartments without a word. Others simply went to ground, figuring another week might give them room to breathe. Extending mercy was part calculation, part kindness. He made those calls. A small extension could mean a larger payoff later. A firm visit could keep an account from collapsing. Balancing those choices became part of his daily routine, a ledger in motion. Influence at the docks was a major source of power. Cargo schedules, hiring halls, and longshore shifts created a landscape where access was everything. Terminal operators needed calm. Delays cost deals. Men who controlled lists and assignments, whether in union offices or nearby hangouts, had leverage. Over years, crews loyal to the family turned that leverage into cash labeled as consulting, labor, peace, or logistics help. Investigators tracked patterns, specific vendors getting repeat contracts, favored companies avoiding bottlenecks, certain names always near the best jobs. Court papers later described no-show, position slots paid despite no work performed, and payments dressed up as legitimate fees. To participants, it looked like the cost of keeping business smooth. To agents, it fit a classic extortion model. He played the mediator when contractors clashed with union stewards, or when two crews overlapped at a sensitive site. If a trucking company complained about unexpected slowdowns, he measured whether the complaint came from true confusion or from a desire to avoid obligations. If a steward hinted at a side payment and then failed to deliver on the service, he made sure promises turned into performance. Names on hiring rolls mattered, and he made certain the right names appeared. The more he kept schedules normal, the less attention the operation drew. That was the goal. Steady, quiet, profitable. Money had to be handled with care once collected. Street cash couldn't simply sit in a drawer. It moved through businesses that could explain deposits with invoices and contracts. Small offices that claimed to advise on deliveries or security provided a legitimate-looking path for funds that were anything but. The path often involved relatives or trusted neighbors fronting companies that rarely advertised. Bank accounts opened under clean names took transfers in amounts small enough to avoid alarms. Sometimes profits passed through restaurants or service firms that did just enough real work to look busy. By the time proceeds reached higher levels, they looked like income from a real customer, not from tailgates and back rooms. He adapted to surveillance. Payphones were used less as technology changed, but he still preferred them to cell lines that pinged towers and left trails of numbers. Meetings stayed short. He picked places with loud kitchens or the white noise of traffic. He learned to spot a new face, 2 tables away, and a camera lens tucked behind a coat on a chair. He also learned that even perfect habits couldn't beat informants. People under pressure talked. Some did it to reduce sentences, some for safety, some out of resentment. Their words fueled the cases that came next. In 2002, federal prosecutors in Brooklyn and Manhattan unsealed indictments that tied him to an array of crimes spanning years. The government said he served as acting boss and then leader, supervising gambling and loans, laundering proceeds, steering union business, and extracting cash from companies that needed trouble to disappear. One set of charges focused on the waterfront. naming the long pattern of influence in hiring and vendor choices. Another included a stark claim that he approved plans to locate and harm a former underboss who had testified for the government and later moved west under a new identity. Investigators said members of the crew made trips, checked addresses, and prepared. No attack took place, but the law does not require a completed act to prosecute a conspiracy. Arrest meant a new schedule, court dates, conferences with lawyers, bail hearings. He walked into federal buildings where he had once stood beside his brother, now facing his own panels of jurors. His lawyers described him as a blue-collar man pulled into a spotlight he never sought, a caretaker who tried to keep peace in a rough environment. Prosecutors portrayed a boss who understood every lever the enterprise pulled and made sure they kept moving. The clash of portraits would be decided first in Brooklyn. The Brooklyn trial turned on the waterfront. Jurors heard from people who described how payments arrived in steady cycles, how lists bent toward connected names, how delays vanished when fees were paid. Cooperating witnesses filled in gaps, explaining conversations where coded words stood in for real tasks. One former insider, once considered a rising figure before he switched sides, described meetings where he said Peter gave instructions about collections and hiring pressure. Agencies presented photos, surveillance notes, and transcripts from recorded calls. The defense pushed back, attacking motives and painting the picture as one of ordinary business deals. The jury weighed it all and returned guilty verdicts on racketeering, extortion, and related money laundering counts. A sentence followed, measured in years rather than months, enough to keep him in federal custody while another case in Manhattan moved toward trial. Inside the Metropolitan Detention Center, days slowed. He kept to himself, read what he could, and met again with lawyers preparing for the next courtroom. This second case included varied racketeering acts, with the allegation about the former underboss at its center. It folded in claims of pressure on businesses that needed access to trades and space in the city, areas where a quiet arrangement could make headaches fade. The story of that alleged plot drew its own attention. The former underboss had once stood near the top before deciding to cooperate. After building a new life in Arizona, he was arrested in an unrelated drug case. The government said that while he lived out west, men tied to the Gambino organization tried to find him. Surveillance logs, travel records, and informant testimony formed the spine of the claim. The fact that nothing happened did not erase the charge. Under conspiracy law, the agreement and steps toward it carry weight. For the government, the case fit a larger story: retaliation and deterrence. Projected from New York to wherever a disloyal figure might land. Away from the courtroom, family life thinned. He had married young, worked steady jobs before shifting fully into the world that his brother ran, and tried to separate home from the street. That border dissolved under the weight of 2 federal cases. Visits took place through glass. Calls were limited and monitored. The quiet that once protected him now meant fewer voices around him. Even then, he remained consistent, low tone, short answers, eyes steady when court officers led him in and out. What made him useful over the years also made him vulnerable in court. He was across different corners of the enterprise: gambling, loans, docks, unions, business squeezes, and money handling. RICO allowed the government to connect those dots into one picture: a continuing criminal enterprise, run like a company, feeding on cash that never touched a tax return. That picture meant the jury didn't need to see a single dramatic act. They needed to believe the structure existed and that he helped direct it. In Brooklyn, they had already said yes. In Manhattan, prosecutors were certain they could secure the same answer. Through it all, he showed the same habits that marked his rise. He prepared, kept notes inside his head, looked for small tells in a witness's face, and trusted few people. He had never been a street-corner celebrity, never someone who smiled for cameras. He was a manager of risk and revenue inside an illegal system, a role built on patience, discretion, and memory. Those traits are assets in business and liabilities in a courtroom where every quiet choice can be turned into evidence of control. As he waited for jurors to return again, the arc from a Bronx childhood to a federal cell felt both long and, in a way, inevitable given the roads he had chosen. What could still be said without dispute was this: he started as a city worker hauling trash in brutal weather, stepped into his brother's orbit as a driver and aide, became a soldier and then a captain, and, by the late 1992, took on the tasks of an acting leader. In doing so, he placed himself at the center of criminal activity that courts found to be real and ongoing: organized betting, punishing loans, pressure on unions and businesses, and financial routing designed to hide the source of proceeds. He carried instructions from prisons to street corners, spoke in code, and kept operations running. When law enforcement closed in, the very steadiness that kept money flowing also kept investigators on his trail. The balance he maintained for years tipped at last under the combined weight of taped calls, flipped insiders, and a statute built for exactly this sort of case. They filed back in with that careful quiet that tells you an answer is coming, the pause before the foreperson looks up. He sat there in a suit that fit fine, but didn't call attention. Hands folded. Eyes steady. For weeks, the Manhattan case had gone over the same terrain from different angles. Cash streams and coded calls, favors traded for silence, plans discussed in rooms where no one thought a microphone might be hiding. Witnesses described errands that sounded like routine logistics until you set them against the statute that gathers everyday acts into a single pattern. Jurors were asked to weigh whether a man who preferred back doors and side streets had guided a network that ran on pressure, secrecy, and money, and whether he had endorsed a plan to find a former underboss who had turned government witness and moved west. They didn't need events to unfold for the charge to stick. Agreement and steps could be enough. The verdict followed the logic of the law. Guilty on racketeering and conspiracy counts. There were no outbursts. He nodded once, as if ticking off the final item in a list he knew might end this way. Sentencing arrived, with its measured phrases. Years added up until they eclipsed the seasons left to a man already past middle age. This time the term was long enough to swallow the one he had received in Brooklyn for the waterfront case, a stretch that centered on extortion, illegal gambling, and money laundering tied to docks and union channels. Put together, the time ahead looked like the rest of a life. Judges cited the reach of the enterprise, the persistence of the conduct, the need to deter others. The defense pointed to his work history, his age, his steady demeanor, his lack of braggadocio. The bench acknowledged it and imposed the term anyway. He left court under guard, a quiet figure moving through a gauntlet of cameras. Prison meant a different kind of routine. Early counts, head checks, a job that kept the day structured. He lifted in a gym that smelled like rubber mats and disinfectant, walked loops in a yard where conversation stayed low, and read papers that arrived late and thin. He chose the library over the television room, saving clippings about cases that touched the life he had lived. To family, he wrote short letters with steady script, talking about weather, books, and the food that passed for Sunday dinner on the inside. He didn't dwell on the case. What happened had happened. Appeals would run their course. The appeals came, as they always do. Arguments about jury instructions, sufficiency of evidence, how the government framed acts within the racketeering framework, whether certain recordings should have been admitted, whether witness deals tainted credibility beyond repair. Panels of judges read transcripts that ran to thousands of pages. They upheld the core of the convictions. A tweak here, a recalculation there. None of it changed the length in a way that mattered. He absorbed the news without comment. The clock in prison is relentless, but it is not loud. It counts the same, whether you argue or sit. From inside, he watched his world change. His brother, the one who had welcomed cameras on sidewalks, had died in federal custody in 2002. He did not attend the funeral. The government would not sign off on that kind of movement for a man it now labeled the head of an organization. Leadership on the street shifted again and again as indictments landed. Men he had known for decades chose different strategies. Some stood fast, others negotiated pleas. A few switched sides and sat down with prosecutors. He read their names in articles pinned to bulletin boards and considered how many quiet dinners had led to this. He had built a reputation on steadiness rather than show, and that showed in the enterprise he helped steer. The crews under him dealt in gambling that stayed just under the radar, unless someone talked. Bets still moved by phone, by coded text, by runners who had done the same route for years. Collections happened in cars, at lunch counters, at back rooms in social clubs that now seemed dated. Borrowers still came for cash they couldn't get through banks. The terms were known: principal, heavy interest, deadlines that felt firm until someone in charge extended them. Those who set the terms always kept leverage. If a borrower stopped answering, someone stopped by. That pattern had powered the group since long before he was old enough to understand it. He had stepped into it with his brother's guidance, and then managed it with his own temperament. The waterfront piece drew agents like a magnet because ports are arteries. Block 1. And the body feels it. Over years, influence meant arranging who unloaded which containers, which firms got contracts to move them, and which names on hiring lists floated to the top. Payments didn't arrive in briefcases in smoky rooms. They arrived as checks to consultancies, as facilitation fees, as recurring transfers labeled with bland words that looked fine on a ledger. Inside the case files, agents traced how those funds moved from companies to intermediaries to people in the network. When they drew the arcs on a board, the same names kept appearing, and Peter sat near the center in the later years, the period when he was described as acting leader and then leader. The Manhattan case's most talked about thread involved the former underboss who had testified against his brother. That witness, living in Arizona under a different wind and sun, had drifted into new trouble and landed in custody again. The government said Peter approved efforts to find him and weigh options. Investigators tied travel, phone traffic, and informant statements into a narrative of a search that never turned into an attack. The defense called it talk-calculated bravado, with no intent to carry it out. The jury sided with the prosecutors. Under conspiracy law, the gap between saying and doing can be enough when steps follow the words. A central reason he rose was his ability to mediate. Disputes on the street aren't only about money, they're about respect, boundaries, and timing. One captain believes a club owner sits in his sphere, another believes the same owner owes him from a favor years back. He listened, weighed history, and drew a line. On a union matter, a steward promised a certain number of shifts to a connected group. When that didn't happen, tempers flared. He arranged a split that kept everyone just satisfied enough. Those choices rarely made headlines, but they kept the operation from cracking. Law enforcement later used that same quality, his presence at the fulcrum, to portray him as the person responsible for the conduct that followed. The money trails were handled with a care that assumed every bank might one day see a subpoena. Small deposits, consistent invoices, entities that did just enough real business to stand up to a quick glance. Some companies were relatives' projects, others belonged to associates with clean records. If questions came, there were contracts to point to and emails that read like ordinary business. Prosecutors who study financial crime know this dance. They pulled the threads until the fabric gave way. Surveillance teams matched bank activity with meetings at diners and clubhouses. When cooperators entered the picture, they supplied the missing explanations. This invoice covered a payment to avoid delays. That retainer masked a demand. Those checks were really a monthly tax to keep labor steady. He had never been a man who liked giving speeches, but he understood that silence can be mistaken for consent. Inside, he kept his circle small. A few men from the city, a couple of older inmates with long bids behind them, a counselor who didn't pry. He worked, kept to routine, and tried to keep small privileges like a library assignment or a slot in the laundry, jobs that offered structure, and a break from crowded blocks. Age showed in his step and in the way he rubbed his eyes after long days under fluorescent lights. Health problems crept in, as they do for anyone serving into their 70s. Aches, a heart that needed monitoring, failing vision that turned reading into a slow task. He filed requests for compassionate release as the years stretched. The forms cited age, medical decline, low risk. Courts weighed them and said no. The seriousness of the crimes and the length still left to serve carried more weight. Back in New York, his family kept living with a name that always drew comment. Some relatives stayed near the old neighborhoods. Others moved out, trying to build quieter lives. His son shared the name and carried both burden and loyalty. His siblings aged. He learned about family events, weddings, funerals, births by phone and mail. He handled the distance, as he had handled most things, with minimal complaint. Prison teaches you how to hold two truths at once. Life outside keeps moving, and your own days stretch and blur. Reporters wrote about him as a reluctant leader, a caretaker boss, who stepped in because the machine needed someone to keep the books balanced and the flow steady while his brother and nephew faced their own legal storms. There was some truth in that. He didn't chase the top spot. It came to him when louder men were either dead or behind bars. Yet stepping into that role meant taking ownership of all that came with it. And courts said he did. The work he managed involved illegal gambling, high-interest lending, coercion in unions and industries that needed labor, and financial routing designed to hide where money came from. He didn't wave flags about it. He simply kept it going until the cases caught up. In the early 2010 seconds, he watched from the inside as old associates cycled through the system. Some returned to the street, after long bids, older and quieter. Others came in for the first time, surprised at how quickly a case file becomes your daily reality. He walked the yard with men who remembered when payphones mattered, and men who had grown up in the era of text messages and celluloid records. He kept his counsel with both. To the younger ones, he said little. They could read the facts of his case and understand the lessons if they wanted them. He didn't write a memoir or give interviews. That wasn't his way. The closest he came to letting anyone in was in small moments. A story about driving his brother before dawn through the city when the streets were still clean of traffic. A memory of a foreman in sanitation who measured a man by whether he finished his route, not by who he knew. Those glimpses showed where he came from: work, family, routine. They also showed how a life can turn when loyalty, opportunity, and an enterprise that predates you pull you in. As the decade turned again, his health worsened. The Bureau of Prisons moved him to a medical facility where specialists could see him. Even there, routine ruled. Meals at set hours, lines for medication, lights out at the same time every night. Lawyers tried another petition, citing age, ailments, and the new policies that allowed courts to consider compassionate release more broadly. The decisions did not change. The harm described in the case files, the leadership role, and the need for consistency in sentencing kept the door closed. He had outlived many of the names that had shaped his youth: bosses, captains, investigators, journalists who had trailed the family for years. He marked their passing and kept going. Days folded into each other until they became seasons. Letters slowed as friends grew older or passed on. He focused on the basics: a good book from the cart, a phone call that connected, a walk in the yard on a clear day. Time does not dramatize itself. It simply accrues. The story of his crimes, as told by prosecutors and accepted by juries, was not theatrical. It was practical and relentless. Revenue from illicit betting, loans that punished the desperate, pressure on vendors, contractors, and union officials at ports and in trades, the laundering of those proceeds through fronts and services, and, on top of that, an approval to hunt a man who had switched sides years earlier. Those points formed the backbone of his legal history. He lived the consequences of them in slow motion over nearly 2 decades inside. What remained, even as his world tightened to the size of a range of beds and a walkway, was the way he carried himself. Measured, contained, rarely hurried. The boy from the Bronx who learned to keep his head down and show up on time had turned into a man whose steadiness served a criminal network until it became evidence against him. The final chapters would not include a return to the old neighborhoods. They would unfold under hospital lights in a federal medical facility, with a file thick enough to explain why a judge had said he would not walk out a free man. When the end came in 2021, it was quiet and expected, the kind of ending that follows a long chain of decisions made in rooms far from microphones and cameras, then pulled into public view in the only rooms that could end it: federal courtrooms where routine choices are weighed, labeled, and punished. The newspapers printed the same photo over and over: the square jaw under gray hair, a man who never looked comfortable with a camera pointed his way. Reporters used phrases that had followed him for years: acting boss, reluctant leader, caretaker, while court files told a firmer story built from transcripts, bank slips, and sworn testimony. He had climbed not by chasing attention, but by performing steady work that kept an old machine humming. That quiet, which shielded him for a time, also made him the person others looked to when the enterprise needed calm hands. In the years after his brother's imprisonment and then death, he leaned into that role, and the acts that came with it became the ledger a judge would read line by line. He had gotten to that seat by steps that were small in the moment, but large in the aggregate. The city job that defined his early adult life taught him to show up in rain and ice, to lift what needed lifting, to let hours speak for him. That ethic carried into the shadow economy he entered more deeply as the 80s became the 90s. Driving, protecting, Relaying messages, those tasks fostered trust among men who believed reliability outranked charisma. In that world, the one who remembered each instruction and returned with a result mattered more than the one who told stories in clubhouses. He fit the first category. Over time, his errands included envelopes, meeting schedules, approvals, and discipline delivered with few words. Inside the family structure, titles meant less than function. A soldier collects and pays, a captain coordinates several crews, and a caretaker maintains flow when others are absent. He moved through those layers as history demanded. When his brother ran the show, Peter's role revolved around support and protection. When the old boss went away, senior members leaned on Peter to keep the middle stable while they handled their own troubles. Later, as the nephew faced cases and the original leader passed, he was the one still on the street, still able to keep crews moving without letting internal frictions spill into the open. The government called that leadership. He insisted he was a placeholder. Courts measured it by results. Gambling was the spine of revenue. Small shops and apartments hosted numbers, action, and sports bets. Lines were set by phone, runners took wagers, and stacks of cash climbed in quiet rooms. Risk management mattered. He advised bookmakers on limits to avoid catastrophic losses when a run of favorites hit. He expected sheet totals each week and kept tabs on collectors who needed reminders to stay punctual. If a bettor stalled, he decided whether to extend grace for a fee or send someone with firmer words. None of this looked dramatic from the outside. It looked like a small business adjusting to customer behavior, except it was not legal, and avoidance of official ledgers was the point. The loan business posed constant decisions. People came to the table who had already exhausted banks and family. Terms were clear. Quick money. Heavy cost. Strict deadlines. Extensions earned additional fees, and defaults drew a visit. He believed in getting paid without starting unnecessary storms. A steady debtor who communicated might be granted extra time. A borrower who ducked calls and moved without notice invited a different conversation. He weighed those circumstances case by case, which is why associates turned to him when their judgment blurred. Discipline, in his hands, meant setting expectations and following through without creating headlines. Union influence and the waterfront remained the most visible points of pressure because they touched major employers and the flow of goods. A port functions on timing. Any disruption ripples outward. Over years, the enterprise learned where to place its weight. Hiring lists, shift assignments, preferred contractors for loading, security, and transport. Through those levers, money moved. Fees paid to friendly firms were recycled as cash to the network. If a terminal manager wanted calm, if a shipping company needed a tricky week to pass without incident, there was a path to arrange that. The label might read consulting or labor relations, but investigators later described it as extortion without raised voices. His job was to keep those arrangements orderly, predictable, and quiet. Because his strength lay in mediation, he came to the table when friction built. Two captains fought over a border where their earners overlapped. He listened, mapped the facts, and cut a line both could live with. On the docks, a steward promised goods would move but then came up short. He made the call, warn once, replace if repeated. In construction, a job flagged by inspectors needed a rapid fix. He tapped contacts who could move paperwork faster. Each decision seemed minor, but together they formed the daily management that kept money flowing and trouble contained. It was logistics dressed in street clothes. Investigators studied that logistics with patience equal to his own. They used the law built for these cases, the racketeering statute that allows prosecutors to argue that many separate acts add up to one continuing crime. Agents logged meetings in coffee shops and diners from Bensonhurst to Staten Island. They followed cars to parking lots where conversations happened with engines idling. They recorded phone calls where code was thin tickets, shirts, packages, words meant to be plain enough to pass in conversation and masked enough to signal value to those in the know. When small details didn't add up, they recruited insiders to explain where the cash came from and where it went. Those insiders, facing their own exposure, turned fragments into a narrative ready for court. The first verdict out of Brooklyn centered on the waterfront. Jurors heard about how influence had become expected in hiring and vendor selection, how a pattern of favored firms and names on lists emerged across seasons, and how money labeled as service fees returned to the network in repeatable amounts. Cooperators described the mechanics: who collected, who delivered, what words were used to signal a payment was due. Financial analysts matched bank movements to those cycles. Defense counsel argued that these were hard-nosed business practices, not crimes. The guilty verdict said otherwise, and the sentence that followed was stiff enough to keep him in custody while the Manhattan case took shape. That second prosecution added weight and drew wider attention because it included the allegation that he approved an effort to find a former underboss who had testified for the government years earlier and had built a new life far from new. York. The government presented travel, calls, and informant accounts that painted a picture of a search begun and permission granted. The defense dismissed it as talk that never ripened. The jury accepted the government's view, and the sentence eclipsed the earlier term. Together, they amounted to a stretch that, given his age, would not likely end in freedom. Life inside shifted through facilities, then settled into a medical center as his health declined. Days were measured by controlled movement, medication lines, regular checks, and the small markers of routine mail call, the book cart, limited recreation. He stayed consistent, low voice, careful words, steady step. He put in requests for compassionate release citing age and chronic illness, pointing to a record without disciplinary problems in custody and to a risk level that he argued had fallen with time. Judges weighed those petitions against the gravity of his convictions and the time still left. They denied them. He absorbed each refusal and returned to the schedule that governed his days. Outside, the landscape continued to shift. The commission tasked with keeping organized crime off the docks increased scrutiny on licensing and background checks. Companies adopted compliance programs and auditors looked for payments that didn't fit contracts. Union leadership changed, sometimes under pressure, sometimes after elections that promised cleaner practices. The old system didn't vanish, but it grew harder to maintain at the scale seen in prior decades. The cases against him fed that pressure. Prosecutors could point to courtroom victories as proof that the law could reach into areas once considered impenetrable. Those who had worked with him took different paths under the same heat. Some accepted plea deals and served shorter terms. Others cooperated and entered protected programs. A few stood trial and lost. He watched those names pass through the news in the prison library. He didn't hold press conferences to answer back or write letters to editors. He kept his reactions private and let the printed words stand. He never embraced the performative mode that had defined his brother's public era. His style remained a steady hum rather than a horn. He never argued that he was innocent of everything. His defense was narrower. That he was a caretaker making sure people didn't turn on each other. A manager of men and schedules in a world that carried its own momentum, long before he took on greater responsibility. That claim collided with the government's presentation of him as the effective head of a criminal enterprise during specific years. Courts chose the latter view because of the breadth of what they connected to his direction. Gambling, loans, pressure on employers and unions, financial laundering, and the authorization of an effort to find a high-profile cooperator. The difference between caretaker and leader may matter in conversation, but the law measured control and benefit. By that metric, he fit the statute. He spent time looking backward because forward held few surprises. He remembered riding shotgun in the pre-dawn, when the city still smelled like wet stone and bakery steam, dropping his brother at doors where men in press suits spoke in low tones. He remembered sanitation runs that trained him to ignore discomfort and just finish. He remembered small wins, a dispute settled without a fight, a week when all routes ran on time, a roll of clean bills counted at a Formica table. He also remembered the day agents knocked, the weight of the indictment in his hands, the first time he heard a tape of his voice played in a courtroom filled with people who studied every syllable. Legacy, if the word applies in such a life, lives in two contradictory places. In neighborhoods, some people still describe him as a steady figure who took on burdens because others were gone, a man without heirs who preferred to walk rather than pose. In legal history, his name sits on cases that bolstered the government's ability to regulate docks and to frame union and vendor pressure as racketeering in modern terms. Both can be true. A person can be modest in manner and central to wrongdoing. He accepted the second truth in the only way he knew, by staying quiet while sentences were read. His passing did not prompt marches or loud memorials. It prompted short articles that folded biographical facts into larger stories about a family that had, for a generation, symbolized a certain New York underworld to the public. Those pieces noted the arc: Bronx birth, city job, quiet ascent, years in charge, convictions, and a death in federal custody. People who knew him told reporters what they always had: that he didn't like the spotlight, that he had been loyal, that he had spent his later years reading and walking in a yard bounded by fences he never got past. Lawyers said they had tried to get him home and failed. Officials offered no comment beyond standard notices. His story also sits inside a broader shift in organized crime. The flamboyance that marked the late 80s and early 90s gave way to muted operations that tried to blend with legitimate business while avoiding wiretaps and informants. He embodied that pivot. Less flash, more patience, fewer public feuds, more quiet agreements. A reliance on long relationships and predictable routines. That approach kept things stable for a while. It also meant that when investigators finally pulled the thread, the tapestry they unwound was complex enough to satisfy the RICO threshold, and the person at the center couldn't claim surprise when the case held. The picture that remains is clear without being loud. A boy born in the Bronx in 1939 learned to keep his head down, to show up, to stay loyal. He took a city job, and then added illegal work that grew until it defined him in the eyes of the law. He managed gambling and loans, nudged unions and businesses, and masked proceeds through companies designed to look ordinary. He approved plans and settled fights. He avoided media, preferred routine, and lasted longer than some because he didn't seek the heat. When charges came, they came layered and detailed. Juries believed the government's account. Sentences turned seasons into decades. He aged, asked to be released, and was refused. He died where long sentences often end, in a federal medical facility, far from the blocks that shaped him. If there is a lesson, it is the mundane nature of the conduct that drew such heavy penalties. There were no car chases or cinematic scenes. There were calls, meetings, envelopes, lists, invoices, and influence exerted at points of leverage. There was a deep reliance on loyalty and the belief that routine could keep risk low. For a time, it worked. Then the same predictability became the map that law enforcement used to trace responsibility back to him. The habits that built his value: show up, remember, decide, collect, became the evidence that confirmed his role. That is how his life, rooted in ordinary rhythms, turned into a case study in how organized crime operates when its leaders prefer a low profile, and how it ends when courts bind those rhythms into a single, punishable story. Paper never told the whole story, but it hinted at the way he liked things done. Notes weren't long. They were lists in his head. Numbers mattered more than adjectives. A bookmaker's sheet balanced or it didn't. A borrower kept pace or slid. A terminal ran smooth or jammed. He measured people by whether they showed up when they said they would, whether they paid when they promised to, whether they understood that silence was a kind of contract. He didn't bark. He made a point, waited, and expected it to stick. On the piers he favored, the day began with clipboards and ended with cash counted under fluorescent light. Hiring halls, with their old chalkboards and newer monitors, looked straightforward from the outside. Inside, names rose and fell in ways that didn't always match seniority. Crews that delivered on time found themselves first in line more often than chance could explain. Terminal managers learned that labor peace was a phrase that covered many kinds of troubles: lateness, no-shows, paperwork that stalled at the wrong desk, a forklift that somehow ended up out of service on the busiest morning of the week. He understood that very little force was needed if timing did the work. That was the essence of the waterfront racket as prosecutors later described it. Nudge the clock. Tilt the hiring list. Guide a contract. A company that felt the pinch reached for a number that could make the pinch stop. He kept meetings short and settings ordinary. A bakery at opening, coffee steaming, trays clattering. A corner booth at a luncheonette where the owner had known him since the 70s and never asked questions beyond, "How are you?" He picked places with sound traffic outside, fans whirring, a radio low in the kitchen so a bug would struggle. He got used to swapping locations if something felt off, used to scanning a doorway for a face that didn't fit. He wasn't paranoid so much as trained by time. Surveillance rarely shouts. It watches you go about your day and writes it down. Lines of money left footprints even when people tried to wipe them. The enterprise used shell firms that filed real paperwork, paid minimal taxes, and issued invoices that looked proper on their face. A consulting company could explain a check labeled site coordination. A security service could justify a monthly retainer. A trucking broker might cover a payment that in truth purchased quiet at a loading dock. Those firms hired a few people, did a bit of business, and kept a desk with a phone that rang just enough to look alive. The design wasn't novel. It was discipline. Don't draw attention. Keep amounts consistent. Avoid patterns that scream. Even so, auditors and agents, given time, followed the trails. They matched deposits to meetings, withdrawals to drop-offs, envelopes to names in the margins of spiral notebooks seized in searches. Wiretaps and room mics taught him another lesson. Code has to be simple. He told men to use words that fit ordinary talk. Tickets, shirts, coffee, papers. Drop the shirts on Tuesday could mean deliver a set amount. Those tickets are past due could signal a collection. The trick was to speak the way regular people speak. The weakness in that trick was how often people forget themselves. A new runner would get excited and say too much. A collector would complain over a line he assumed was clean. Those slips became exhibits, read in court in voices that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. He heard his own phrases replayed years later by agents with headphones and notebooks, and he knew the game had changed when the law learned to stretch context around plain words. His climb inside the organization never followed a script with a single night of anointment or a speech that crowned him. It was a matter of being the person others trusted to show up, remember the details, and keep men from colliding. In one era, he was a driver and bodyguard who carried an extra jacket for the boss and checked street corners for parked vans that smelled like electronics. In another, he was a captain who balanced accounts and settled which crew handled which block. By the late 90s, with the nephew tied up in cases and the old boss behind glass, he was the man the street called when something important needed a yes or no. Law enforcement took that pattern and called it leadership. Journalists called it reluctant rule. He didn't argue with labels because labels don't change schedules. The first big case against him, in Brooklyn, read like a map of port culture. Witnesses described no-work and no-show positions that paid steady wages for minimal effort. The kind of arrangement that had lived on the waterfront for decades under different names. They spoke about Christmas tribute, holiday money that moved up from workers and vendors. They talked about which companies always seemed to get the easy lanes, and which vendors landed work even when their bids weren't the lowest. Jurors heard from dock workers and supervisors, from union men and stevedores, from analysts who put bank statements next to calendars. The defense argued that tough bargaining and tradition were being painted as crime by people who wanted reduced sentences. The jury sided with the government's picture. To them, the pattern looked like extortion coded as custom, and they decided he sat close enough to the controls to be held responsible. The Manhattan case turned on Reach. The government didn't only want to show that he kept money flowing. It wanted to show that he authorized a hunt for a man whose testimony had helped lock away his brother. That witness had gone west, built a new life, then ended up in an Arizona cell on a separate case. Prosecutors said associates made trips, checked addresses, and came back with updates. They said Peter knew and approved. No one carried out an attack. Under the conspiracy law, that didn't matter if jurors believed an agreement existed and steps started. The defense called it puff-it-up talk, in a circle where bravado is cheap. Jurors listened to travel records, to informants who described conversations in detail, to the old hurt that still hung in the air. They delivered guilty counts that would keep him in federal custody long beyond the term from Brooklyn. He wasn't a man to give interviews from prison or to write letters that tried to repaint the past. He let his lawyers handle filings and kept his time centered on routine. A day in a medical unit has its own rhythm. Early checks, pills, a nurse with a clipboard, a walk under a sky that looks the same no matter the fence. He filed for compassionate release as age wore him down, describing ailments and a reduced risk to the public. Judges read those requests and weighed them against the record that described him as a leader. The record won. He accepted the decisions like he accepted most outcomes without dramatic complaint, with a half nod that said he knew there wasn't much else to try. The family name kept circling headlines even while he was inside. Brothers, a nephew, cousins, Some made efforts to step away from the old patterns. Others found themselves in more indictments as the years unfolded. Agents never stopped reading wire orders that bore the same surname. The Gambino family itself shifted through new faces on the street. Men with quieter profiles who tried to blend business with a thinner layer of tradition. From his cell, he watched the changing of the guard happen again and again, each time with less theater and more spreadsheets. The world he had helped stabilize moved on without him, which is the only way such worlds survive. People who knew him in the old neighborhood spoke about a different side. A man who always had something kind to say to an elder on the block, who tipped well, who remembered a grocer's kid by name when that kid came back from school. That warmth coexisted with a system that siphoned from businesses and workers through pressure others couldn't match. Holding both truths is part of understanding him. He was loyal and steady. He also presided over illegal enterprises that courts described in careful, relentless words. A person can be decent in private and responsible in public for conduct that harms. He lived with that contradiction and never offered a speech to reconcile it. What made the waterfront piece so enduring was its simplicity. If a terminal runs on time, money flows. If it stutters, money bleeds. Insert a small variable, a delay at a gate, a sudden shortfall in trained hands and urgency spikes. Turn that urgency into a payment that prevents the variable next month. Repeat. He didn't invent the cycle. He made sure it stayed predictable. He kept a calendar of when contracts came up, when a company's quarter ended, when a union meeting might turn noisy. He placed calls right before those dates. The business owners knew what the calls implied because they had heard them every season for years. Gambling, meanwhile, kept its own tempo. Sundays in fall were heavy. March brought college tournaments that could wipe out a book that hadn't set limits right. He had a feel for risk and told bookmakers to cap exposure on certain games. He set fallback plans for when a runner got picked up or a location felt burned. He told collectors to spread visits so they didn't walk in and out of the same building too many days in a row. He wanted churn without friction, churn that fed envelopes on schedule. That envelope rhythm, weekly, bi-weekly, the first of the month, matched certain deposit patterns that forensic accountants love. The same details that kept him comfortable gave the government a way to paint a whole picture. The loan work took a different kind of reading. He paid attention to tone as much as numbers. A borrower calling ahead to say a shipment had been delayed earned time at a price. A borrower who avoided calls drew a knock. He had a low tolerance for waste. Wasted chances, wasted effort, wasted money. In his mind, discipline avoided bigger problems later. What he called discipline, statutes call enforcement within an illegal lending scheme. The legal language stripped away the daily give and take and replaced it with categories. High-interest loans, collection, threat, payment. Jurors are taught to see those categories, not the routine that softens them. His fate lived in that translation. When people speak about racketeering, they often imagine violence first. His case showed something else. The weight of habit used to tilt outcomes. A phone call at the right time. A name scratched in at the top of a hiring list. A lunch that reset a contractor's expectations. A check that moved through a quiet office with a plaque on the door. He functioned as the conductor of those small moves. That's why agents focused on him and why prosecutors felt confident tying disparate acts to his direction. Organized crime, at its most enduring, looks like paperwork and punctuality, under a layer of intimidation that doesn't need to be shouted. He never tried to reinvent the enterprise with new schemes or far-flung ventures. He preferred the known circuits, ports, unions, gamblers, borrowers, small businesses that rely on steady schedules. That preference helped the family avoid turf wars that draw heat fast. It also meant that when the government finally charted the system, the chart looked familiar, and a familiar chart is easy to teach a jury. His steadiness built a wall around the enterprise. It also gave the prosecution a neat story arc. By the time he reached his last years, his world had narrowed to a few facts he could control. Stay polite, keep order in your small corner, hold to routine. The larger facts had been decided, convictions affirmed, sentences set, release petitions denied. He died with the label the government hung on him intact. It's rare in his world to see that label last to the end without a late burst of publicity, a claim of reinvention, or a loud memoir. He left none of that. He left case numbers, transcripts, and memories held by people on both sides of the line. Look at the long arc, and you see how a city shaped him. The Bronx taught him to save words and use effort as proof. Staten Island gave him diners and ferry rides that doubled as mobile offices. Brooklyn and Manhattan handed him courtrooms where the quiet posture that had served him so well became a canvas for prosecutors to fill. His life ran on schedules, routes as a city worker, pickups as a collector, visits to a federal prison, medication lines in a medical ward. Schedules made him valuable. Schedules became the net. People asked, after his death, whether he would have chosen differently if he could go back. No one can answer that for him, because he never performed regret for an audience. What he did show is that loyalty, once chosen, held. He stood with his brother when the cameras crowded sidewalks. He stood with a nephew who took the heat of his own era. He stood with crews when they needed someone to break ties cleanly. He stood with his lawyers when a verdict came back like a weight placed on a scale. You can call that stubbornness, or duty, or simply the only way he knew to be. It's part of why people who disliked everything he represented still describe him as consistent. In the end, the facts that matter are the ones the record supports. He was born in the Bronx in 1939. He worked for the city, then for the organization his brother led. He handled gambling, loan collections, and influence in unions and on the waterfront. He used companies to launder proceeds. He was convicted in federal courts in Brooklyn and Manhattan of racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and, in the second case, of conspiring to have a former underboss located and harmed. He received long terms that kept him in custody until he died in 2021 inches of federal medical facility. These are the stones of the path. Around them lies the texture of a life carried out in low tones and tight circles. A life that shows how long a quiet manager can keep an old engine running, and how, once the engine is mapped, a prosecutor can explain it to 12 people and shut it down. The ceiling lights in the medical unit hummed like a steady note, the kind of sound you stop hearing until the room goes quiet. He woke to that tone, to the rattle of a cart, to shoes squeaking on waxed floors. Routine held him up. Blood pressure check, a pill in a paper cup. A nurse who'd learned he preferred few words. He kept his calendar by heart now, not by page calls on certain days. Letters from family when a holiday neared. Lawyers when a filing date approached. He measured time by those markers and by memory, which had always been his strongest tool. Inside or outside, he had lived by lists that no one else could see. From that fluorescent world, his mind walked back to the stretch when he carried the most weight on the street. He remembered how the older captains grew cautious after the 1992 verdict on his brother, how they looked around the room to see who would give the next instruction. He was not the loudest voice, never had been, but men looked to him because he did not rattle. Tasks that used to be family errands, driving, guarding, delivering, had turned into decisions about who got paid first, who needed to be told to wait, which crew should step in where another stumbled. He didn't think of it as promotion. It was maintenance. The same way a city worker treats a route. You finish it because it's yours. The docks were the clearest example of how he worked. A port is a schedule in steel form. When cranes pause, money burns. He used that truth, without shouting. Terminal managers learned to make calls at the right moment, to certain numbers, after which delays melted. Hiring halls learned that the list on the wall had room for names that kept the peace. Stevedoring firms understood that a vendor who hired a consultant with the right connections suffered fewer headaches. On paper, that looked like contracts and invoices. In practice, it meant an enterprise had turned timing into leverage. He didn't need to explain it more than once. People in that world read signals for a living. He relied on a simple rule with gamblers: manage exposure or drown. He guided bookmakers to cap bets on games that could crush a sheet. He asked for tallies at set times, always on the same day, because predictability made the money flow smoother. Collectors learned to space their visits, to vary routes, to avoid patterns that would draw attention. He wanted rhythm without routine so obvious that any agent with a calendar could follow it. Even with that care, the government built a picture by watching longer than most people have patience to watch. They stitched small observations into a pattern so tight even minor creases looked like proof. Loan collections lived in a different key. He judged intent. A borrower who called before a deadline and explained a late shipment might find extra days at a cost that fed the business. A borrower who went silent met a firmer schedule. He believed order preserved profit. Courts later called the same behavior enforcement within an unlawful lending scheme. Two descriptions of one habit, seen from different sides of a bench. He accepted that split the way he accepted most facts. It existed, and no speech would undo it. The adult entertainment scene in Manhattan gave prosecutors another lane. Those venues depend on access, security, and a lack of sudden problems. Owners understand risk. They also understand that the right introductions can lower it. The government said he approved pressure that turned those truths into a steady payment stream. Money moved in labeled envelopes, or through retainers to small companies that offered logistics help. Managers testified that they paid to avoid disruptions they couldn't afford. Defense attorneys argued those were hard bargains, not crimes. Jurors disagreed when the paper trail matched the stories by people who had sat in those back rooms. The second Manhattan case carried the allegation that drew headlines: authorization to find a former underboss who had helped end the old era by testifying, a man who had gone west, only to end up in custody again on an unrelated case. Prosecutors said New York associates made trips, asked questions, gathered addresses, and reported back. They said he knew, and nodded. Law doesn't wait for an attack to occur if the agreement and steps are there. That's how a plan becomes a count on a verdict sheet. He must have known, sitting at the table, that the charge would be hard to shake once agents connected travel records, phone logs, and words from insiders under pressure. He never embraced the public stage his brother had owned. He left that to men who liked lights outside courthouses. His nature, for better and worse, was to keep to the side. That kept him safer for a while. It also meant others were willing to trust him with their earnings and their problems. A captain who needed a decision about a border came to him. A labor contact who needed a favor with a hiring list called him. A contractor who couldn't afford delays reached a small office that billed for labor relations and found that the next week went smoother. Those were the gears he kept greased. Each gear alone looked ordinary. Together, they drove a machine that prosecutors later described with a single word that rewrites routine into crime. The lawyers who represented him were seasoned. They attacked credibility, highlighted deals the government offered cooperators, pointed to the ordinary language on tapes, and reminded jurors that business is often tough without being illegal. They lost the big fights. Rico let the government take loose threads and braid them. Once a jury accepts the existence of an enterprise and a role near its center, each small act becomes a part of a larger story that feels obvious in hindsight. He listened as verdicts were read and said little. He had always believed that words said in a courtroom rarely helped the person wearing the cuffs. Inside, he took jobs that avoided drama. Library work suited him. Laundry was fine. He preferred tasks with clear endpoints. Health issues mounted slowly. Vision that faded. Joints that stiffened. A heart that needed more attention. Complications sent him to the medical side, where nurses learned he never asked for special treatment. He filed for compassionate release more than once, citing age and diagnosis, pointing to decades of custody without incident. The denials were brief and final. Courts weighed his role, the seriousness of the offenses, and the policy goals of long sentences for organized crime leaders. His name and history outweighed his decline. Letters from family kept him tied to the world outside. They asked for stories from the old neighborhoods, so he wrote about smells and sounds rather than cases. He described a bakery where you could feel the heat from the ovens on your face, a ferry ride that felt like a small vacation when the wind was kind, a diner where the owner poured coffee before you Saturday. He did not describe meetings or envelopes. Those belonged to a lane he no longer traveled. He never put his own name on a memoir. He didn't call reporters after verdicts. People who'd known him guessed why. Attention had never helped him. It helped the government. He had learned that when he watched jurors lean forward as an agent played a recording, in that room every flourish hurt, and silence didn't save you, but it didn't add weight either. So he kept the same setting he'd used in his youth. Low volume, short sentences, no theatrics. The waterfront piece, which had anchored the first conviction, continued to change after he left the street. Oversight boards tightened license standards. Inspectors checked hiring records and flagged patterns that once passed without notice. Companies hired compliance officers whose job was to say no to consulting agreements that sounded like insurance. The calendar of tribute holiday payments and regular stipends shrank under that attention. When he read about those changes, he understood them. Pressure meets counter-pressure. In his day, the enterprise offered certainty in a chaotic business. Later, reform offered a different kind of certainty backed by law. His habit of mediation lasted even when the only disputes he saw were small prison matters. Two men argued over a TV schedule. He suggested a rotation that no one loved, and everyone accepted. A new inmate struggled with the pace of the place. He told him to keep to routine, to find work, to let time be the tool it always is in custody. Those tips were the same ones that had kept him steady for decades. Systems like people who don't make waves. He had built a life on that idea. It had lifted him. It had also given investigators a stable target to map. Looking backward, he could see how the family's arc mirrored the city's. The showmanship of the late 80s crashed against federal strategy in the early 90s. In the vacuum that followed, organizers like him tried to replace flash with order. They did well for a time because they understood schedules, paperwork, and the value of not talking. Technology shifted the ground. Wiretaps moved to cell sites. Surveillance grew subtler. Cooperating witnesses became more common as sentences rose. The same design that kept the enterprise profitable: regular meetings, consistent collections, predictable rhythms, made it legible to people with enough patience to sit and take notes. When people remember him, they almost always mention steadiness. They say he didn't drink deep, didn't chase the night, didn't talk more than a situation required. They also remember who he was aligned with and what that meant for the city around him. Cash that flowed from wagers never reported. Loans that tightened their grip. Unions and companies that learned to pay to avoid trouble. Money that changed clothes on paper to look clean when its source lived elsewhere. Those are the acts that formed his record, the ones jurors weighed and judges punished. A person can be consistent and still be wrong in the eyes of the law. He lived with that judgment. He had carried messages from his brother's prison for years, speaking to captains and earners while keeping language spare. He had then taken on the role of caretaker when younger faces went away, moving from aide to coordinator to the man who said yes or no when two sides needed a ruling. He had helped keep ports, unions, and certain industries under pressure that quietly lifted money into envelopes and accounts. He had routed that flow through companies that billed for services designed to be vague. He had approved, according to courts, a plan to find a former underboss who had turned on the family. Those points formed the spine of the government's case, and no later letter or petition could remove them. As his world narrowed to a bed, a locker, and a few faces he saw each day, he remained himself. He answered softly. He kept promises as small as a shared newspaper. He lined up when told. Habit is the last possession a person keeps when choices fall away. He died far from the corner bakeries and sunny-struck stoops of his youth, in a medical center where staff learned to say his last name without the shadow of headlines. The record closed with the same facts reporters used in short obituaries. Born in the Bronx, worked city routes, rose inside the Gambino organization to run day-to-day operations after his brother was imprisoned and then died. Convicted in Brooklyn and Manhattan of racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and conspiracy. Denied early release despite declining health. Passed in federal custody in 2021. What remains for the city is a lesson that has nothing to do with myth. His life showed how much of organized crime lives in patience, in quiet leverage applied at the right moment, in paperwork that looks ordinary until you widen the frame. It also showed how law enforcement, given enough time and the right tools, can teach jurors to see that frame. He was not a gangster from the movies. He was a manager who turned routine into influence. That was his gift. It was also, in the end, the easiest thing to map, explain, and convict. Courtrooms have their own weather. Air runs cool, light sits flat, voices sharpen as if a ceiling filter trims everything fuzzy from a sentence. He sat through that climate more than once, while government witnesses stepped into the box and told jurors what they had done, who they had called, and which orders they believed came from him. Some had worn wires. Others had kept ledgers. A few had never written anything down but could recite dates and places because risk had given them long memories. Their names became familiar to anyone following the case. A former insider, once a rising figure with family ties and a sharp suit, now wore the label cooperating witness and described meetings where cash moved from hand to hand, where a nod authorized a collection, where a dispute ended because a quiet voice told it to. Jurors learned the nicknames and the code. They also learned the law's version of a story he had lived without fanfare for years. One thread that drew heavy attention involved a midtown nightlife spot whose brand had appeared in tabloids. Its owners, the government said, paid to prevent trouble and to make certain logistics security, deliveries, permits stayed smooth. Payments arrived as envelopes or as retainer checks to consulting firms with bland names. Managers testified about conversations in back rooms, where a request didn't sound like a request at all. Defense counsel pressed them on motives, on deals they had made for lighter time, on whether tough talk in a tough business had been misread as crime. The paper trail deposits matching known drop dates, invoices that echoed the cadence of tribute, notes in a cooperator's book helped the government close the circle. The waterfront case, heard across the river in Brooklyn, turned an entire industry into a chalkboard lesson. Jurors heard about hiring lists that did not always match seniority, about no-work slots that paid people who rarely appeared on the pier, about holiday money that moved upward every December as predictably as a season. They learned that vendors with the right advisors avoided delays that less connected firms endured. Terminal managers, stevedores, union officials, and rank and workers sketched a picture of influence woven into everyday operations. To someone inside that world, it might have looked like tradition. To the law, it looked like extortion conducted without spectacle. The verdict stamped that view as fact. The allegation that he approved efforts to find and harm a former underboss who had become a government witness carried a different weight. The man who had once stood next to his brother had testified in 1991 and then moved out west to build a new life, only to be arrested years later in a case unrelated to the old New York story. The government said associates flew to Arizona, asked around, took down addresses, and reported back. Phone records, travel itineraries, and the words of insiders formed the backbone of a case that did not require a completed act. The law calls it conspiracy when an agreement and steps forward exist. That's what jurors found. He heard the verdict, absorbed it with a slow blink, and braced for a sentence that would be measured in decades. Between the first trial and the second, he had seen how the RICO statute could turn a rack of small facts into a single heavy conclusion. The statute was built to show continuity and control, to frame separate axe bets collected in Queens, a hiring list revised in Brooklyn, a retainer check cut in Manhattan as parts of one enterprise. Once jurors accept that frame, each phone call and meeting becomes a bead on the same string. His defense team tried to cut the cord by attacking credibility, by saying that witnesses were telling tidy stories to please prosecutors. But prosecutors had learned to pair memory with material, dates stamped on bank slips, photographs of meetings in familiar diners, recordings that turned neutral words into context when paired with other evidence. The bundle held. Much of that context came from people who had sat across tables from him for years. One former captain, later a government witness, told jurors about the season after John's imprisonment in 1992, when senior figures asked who would keep calendars aligned. Another described the late 90s, when the nephew's legal trouble pulled him from daily management and someone had to decide where cash went and which border disputes got settled. They painted him as a stabilizer, a man who didn't enjoy giving orders but gave them anyway. That portrait the reluctant coordinator didn't soften the legal conclusion. The law looks for responsibility, not appetite. He understood that distinction instinctively, perhaps because he had started in a world where showing up mattered more than posture. The Department of Sanitation had taught him to measure a day by what got done. The street taught him to measure it by what got collected, who was kept in line, and whether business kept breathing. The two rhythms overlapped in ways he probably only noticed later. Routes, schedules, quotas, predictability. That predictability became a virtue and a vulnerability. Agents learned to wait in one spot on Tuesdays because Tuesdays were always when a set of envelopes changed hands. They knew which holidays drew gatherings inside certain restaurants. They learned the cadence of tribute and used it to build calendars and affidavits. The dockside influence that anchored the Brooklyn case rested on relationships he had tended for years. Crews who managed longshore shifts learned to nudge names up or down lists. Terminal operators learned to call a consultant when storms, literal or bureaucratic, threatened a tight window. Vendors who supplied gear and muscle learned to hire firms that came recommended if they wanted deliveries to roll on time. He acted as the quiet guarantor, the person who could calm a stevedore's complaint on Monday and a manager's fear on Friday. That guarantee carried a price. In a market where timing is money, paying to smooth timing feels less like a bribe than a rational expense. Prosecutors insisted it was something else, and jurors agreed. Gambling never stopped generating cash. It ebbed and flowed with the sports calendar, spiked during football playoffs, dipped in late summer, roared during college tournament weeks. He managed exposure by telling bookmakers to cap risk on games that could wipe them out. He tracked which runners could be trusted to count cleanly and which needed someone watching over a shoulder. Collections required judgment. A bettor who could be kept long-term was more valuable than one who paid once and skipped town. He weighed whether to apply pressure now or wait a week. Those micro-decisions, all economic on their face, later became evidence of participation in an illegal enterprise. Jurors learned terms like VIG and points without having to wade into numbers that would have bored them. The point wasn't math. It was structure. The loan business demanded even more reading of people. A borrower in trouble who still called was treated differently from one who vanished. He believed that firm schedules prevented messes that spilled into the street. That belief translated into visits that prosecutors later framed as coercion. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. People who live on thin margins understand subtext. The difference between the way he described those interactions and the way the government did was the difference between culture and statute. A culture can tolerate the squeeze, as long as it stays within limits everyone agrees to. A statute counts steps. Loan terms, deadline, contact, payment with intent, supplying the rest. The entertainment business in Manhattan offered another lever because it lives on permits, lady-night logistics, and a constant need for calm. Managers who feared sudden inspections or abrupt staffing gaps learned that certain advisors could keep things moving. Those advisors billed retainers, issued invoices, and made introductions. He oversaw that flow without turning it into theater. The government said that behind the paper sat pressure, and that behind the pressure sat him. In court, former staff from those venues described calendars of payments and code phrases that signaled who expected what by which date. The jurors didn't need to picture back rooms. They needed to see patterns, and the exhibits gave them that. His family life, which he kept deliberately separate, still threaded through the period that led to his arrests. He visited his brother in prison, carrying messages with the caution of someone who assumed every syllable might be parsed later. He dealt with the nephew's legal troubles by trying to keep crews from fracturing. He sent money to wives and children of men who went away, a normal practice in that world designed to keep loyalty intact. Those disbursements appeared in notes seized by agents and were presented as proof that tribute ran upward in exact amounts. What to one side looked like care to keep families afloat, looked to the other like the organized distribution of illegal proceeds. By the time agents moved in 2002, he had become the person a dozen separate teams were watching. Surveillance notes in one case matched photographs in another, and recordings in a third. The overlap created a confirmatory loop. A face in a booth in Staten Island appeared again in a Queens parking lot, and then near a Brooklyn hiring hall. Each sighting on its own meant little. Placed on a timeline, they told a story of oversight across rackets. That's why the Brooklyn and Manhattan convictions stacked rather than splintered. Two sets of jurors in two courthouses looked at different corners of the same structure and saw the same outline. Sentences added up to a term that eclipsed the years he had left. He took the news without the public displays that sometimes accompany long bids. In custody, he kept to jobs that asked for reliability rather than personality. Health problems arrived as they do for everyone who ages. A transfer to a federal medical center put him in a place where the day was organized by medications and checkups. He filed petitions for release based on age and illness, citing a record of good behavior inside, and a life expectancy that courts could measure against the policy aims of his sentence. Motivated by caution and precedent, judges declined. From that smaller world, he could still see how the one he had managed changed without him. The Waterfront Commission tightened controls on who could hold certain jobs. Unions reworked bylaws and cooperated more closely with law enforcement. Companies hired compliance officers whose signature on a contract mattered as much as a handshake used to. Some of those changes came from the cases in which he was a defendant. Government lawyers could point to courtroom wins and argue for stronger oversight. The industry adapted. The old term, labor peace, once a euphemism covered by consulting fees, acquired a new meaning rooted in audits and rules. News reached him in slow drips. A former subordinate released, another old name indicted, a union electing new leadership, a policy paper praising reforms at the port. He read and understood that cycles turn, crews adjust. The enterprise that had defined his adult life shrank, fractured, and morphed into quieter forms under other names. That didn't rewrite his part in it. It just proved what he had always known. Systems crave stability. In his day, he provided it from the shadows. Later, different systems tried to replace that stability with law and paperwork. The public image attached to his last name will always be his brother's swagger, the coats and cameras and sound bites. He had none of that. His imprint sits in ledgers and calendars, in meeting notes and transcripts that speak in unadorned language about schedules, collections, and lists. That is how he ran things. Plain words, consistent timing, caution as a habit. It made him valuable during years when Flash got men arrested. It also made it easier for prosecutors to explain his role to jurors. A simple story sells, whether in a clubhouse or a courtroom. He never claimed to be a visionary, only a custodian. Yet custodians carry keys and decide which doors stay locked. He held those keys for a stretch that mattered, long enough to touch the docks, the gambling sheets, the loan books, and businesses that needed calm. He funneled proceeds through companies designed to pass a quick glance. He relayed instructions from a prison cell block to the street and carried reports back the other way. He approved moves and settled boundaries. He did it with a voice that rarely rose. That is the record that followed him to the end of his life, the record that juries accepted and judges punished with time he could not outlast. When people argue about legacy around a table, they tend to chase the dramatic. His life refuses that bait. Its lesson is quieter, how endurance and organization can power a criminal enterprise for years without fireworks, and how the same endurance gives investigators a clean shot once they learn to treat routine as evidence. He built order from habit. The law built a case from the same material. The symmetry explains both his rise and his fall. He woke to the murmur of wheels on linoleum, a cart rolling past the doorway with cups and charts rattling softly. The kind of sound that tells you where you are without opening your eyes. Morning checks came in a practice sequence blood pressure cuff, a quick light in the eyes, a paper cup with pills, and then the corridor settled into the measured quiet that always followed. In that quiet, he kept a private clock. Certain days brought family calls if the phones cooperated. Others brought letters the handwriting familiar, the tone steady, stories about cold mornings in the old boroughs, or a grandchild's school project that needed cardboard and glue. He read slowly, reread, and placed each page back in an envelope as if he could hold on to the day by keeping the paper neat. No one can talk about where he ended without looking at how he moved through the years that shaped him. Before the newspaper cameras, before the courtroom benches, there were city routes with their own brute rhythm. The Department of Sanitation gave him an early routine he carried everywhere. Arrive when the sun hasn't warmed the sidewalk yet. Finish what you start. Lean on reliability more than charm. That ethic drew attention in a different arena, where showing up mattered as much as anything you could say. He became useful to men who valued a person who remembered messages and kept appointments to the minute. That usefulness pulled him from errands into responsibility and, later, into a corner of the underworld that thrived on order. The Gambino organization did not hand out titles with plaques. Standing grew from tasks completed, and from how other men deferred when you spoke. He began as a driver and guard for his younger brother, whose taste for the spotlight rewired how the city thought about bosses. Cameras liked the younger man's swagger, the coats and quips. They barely noticed the older brother at the edge of the frame who parked the car, checked the sidewalk, and guided his employer through doors. But among insiders, that quiet presence built trust. Messages that had to be relayed without leaks passed through him. Meetings that needed someone to keep time stayed on schedule because he watched the clock. Over years, helpers shifted into decider, the person called when crews couldn't agree on money, territory, or who owed what to whom. The law's focus tightened after the 1992 conviction that sent his brother away for life. Investigators no longer chased headlines. They chased patterns. They assigned squads and let them sit at a distance, notebooks open, lenses focused. In that climate, his value increased. When the nephew faced heavy cases at the end of the decade and could no longer manage the daily flow, someone had to keep the enterprise's various branches from tangling. He did what he had always done: managed schedules, kept people at their posts, nudged disputes toward quiet settlements. He did it while assuming that every meeting could be observed and every call could be logged. The waterfront stayed a central concern for everyone involved. Ports don't forgive slowdowns. Containers tick like clocks, and a pause on a Monday can ruin a week. Men close to him learned how to place weight on hiring lists and shift assignments. Terminal operators learned to keep numbers handy for days when a sudden staffing gap or a mishap at a gate threatened to balloon into lost time. Advisory firms with clean names appeared on invoices, offering labor relations or site coordination to explain payments that smoothed schedules. To the industry, it looked like a cost of doing business on tight margins. To prosecutors, it looked like pressure dressed in polite language, orchestrated by people who understood how to turn seconds into leverage. Away from the peers, gambling delivered steady cash. Sheets followed sports seasons and holidays. He instructed bookmakers to limit risk when a slate of favorites could produce a punishing Sunday, and he preferred counts on predictable days because predictability fed control. Runners, collectors, and customers all depended on that cadence. A bettor who stalled on a debt drew a call and, if needed, a visit. He judged on tone as much as arithmetic. A client who warned about a late payment might earn extra days at a price. A client who disappeared triggered a different response. Those judgments, quiet, incremental, aimed at keeping money flowing, became the architecture of the government's case once agents gathered enough fragments to draw them as one picture. The loan side, a different but related stream, demanded a cool read of people under strain. Terms were rough, deadlines strict, extensions expensive. He disliked turmoil that spilled into public view. He believed measured responses preserved profit and avoided unnecessary storms. That belief translated into choices that prosecutors later labeled enforcement within an unlawful lending scheme. Jurors didn't have to imagine fists on tables to convict. They only had to see a system that imposed costly terms and backed them with influence. Cooperators explained how this worked in practice. Analysts lined up payments with dates. The statute connecting it all, the racketeering law, gave the jury a frame for turning individual acts into a single enterprise. Then came the two trials that set the boundaries for his final years. In Brooklyn, the courtroom became a diagram of port life. Witnesses walked jurors through hiring practices and vendor selections that looked innocuous until you saw the same companies and names benefit over and over. They described no-work slots that paid steadily, seasonal tribute that arrived like clockwork, and a climate where cooperation with certain intermediaries produced smooth days. The defense called it tradition, bargaining, old habits that ran through an industry defined by tight windows and hard labor. The jury called it something else and returned guilty counts on racketeering, extortion, and money laundering. In Manhattan, prosecutors added a charge with a different color. They said he approved efforts to locate Salvatore Gravano, the former underboss whose testimony in the early 90s helped end his brother's reign. Gravano had moved to Arizona, built another life, and then faced new charges unrelated to New York. Investigators presented travel records, phone logs, and the words of insiders who described searching for addresses and reporting back. No attack occurred. The law did not require one. The conspiracy count turned on agreement and steps. Jurors weighed the evidence and found that those elements existed. That verdict added a long term to the time he already faced, long enough to make the future look like a straight road without a turnoff. He entered custody with the same habits he'd carried for decades. He took jobs that asked for reliability, avoided loud groups, and learned the routines of each facility. Appeals came and went, addressing jury instructions and evidentiary choices rather than sweeping claims. They did not break the core findings. Health problems accumulated as they do with age, failing eyesight, heart issues, the aches that make stairs feel longer. He filed for compassionate release more than once, citing medical decline and arguing that age reduced any risk he posed. Judges weighed those filings against the record that had labeled him a leader of a criminal enterprise, and against sentencing goals in organized crime cases. The answer stayed no. From the medical ward, he followed the outside world at a remove measured in days rather than hours. He read about oversight agencies tightening rules on who could work in sensitive port positions. He saw unions elect new leadership and adopt rules meant to close doors that had long been left ajar. He saw companies hire compliance officers whose signatures on contracts replaced quiet guarantees. Some of those shifts were direct outcomes of the prosecutions that had targeted his circle. A win in court becomes fuel for policy. The industry he had helped steer towards certain vendors and certain names reshaped itself with audits and background checks. He did not write a book or sit for interviews to explain himself. That wasn't style or strategy, it was nature. He had always believed that life is lived in action, not commentary. Still, he could find words when writing to family about ordinary things. He told one relative about catching the smell of yeast and sugar in his head when he read about a bakery anniversary in the paper. He described the ferry as he remembered it, a short voyage that felt like stolen calm on certain mornings. He wrote about a coach from a youth league he used to pass on the street, the man's whistle hanging from a cord and his voice cutting through winter air. Those were the details he chose to keep, not meetings, not agency acronyms, not court dates. Men he had known long before the arrests passed through the same corridors at different times. Some had cooperated and lived under new names in other places. Some returned to the street after long bids, older and quieter, with a different sense of risk. Others arrived stunned by how quickly years can be stacked by a judge's sentence. He was not a counselor, but routine makes teachers of anyone who lives inside it long enough. He advised new arrivals to find work, to avoid feuds, to let time be the tool it always is in custody. He said little about his own case. People could read. They didn't need the headline from his mouth. His own end approached without drama. In February 2021, at a federal medical center in North Carolina, he died at 81. The notice was sparse, as they always are. Reporters added context. Older brother of a famous boss, former sanitation worker, later a leader of the Gambino family, according to the government, convicted in Brooklyn and Manhattan of racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and conspiracy linked to efforts to locate a former underboss. They noted that petitions for early release had been denied despite health troubles. They counted the years he had served. Then the news cycle moved on, as it always does. What remains worth saying is less about romance or myth and more about systems. He embodied a version of organized crime that prizes patience and logistics. Instead of dramatic scenes, think of calendars with marks for collection days, of lists where certain names rise, of invoices that turn pressure into paperwork. He turned those mechanics into money for years because he valued repeatable processes over spectacle. Law enforcement, learning to see those processes as evidence, built cases that turned his strengths into liabilities. Once jurors accepted the frame of an enterprise, the most ordinary fax coffee at the same table on the same day of the week, a phone call before a contract deadline became pieces of a pattern. His case also shows how family can be both compass and anchor. Blood ties opened the door and cemented obligation. He stood with his brother when the heat was brightest, visited him behind glass, and carried messages with care. He steadied the machine when the nephew ran into legal trouble. He made sure families of jailed associates had enough to cover rent, a practice meant to keep loyalty strong. Those acts, humane inside that culture, became entries in ledgers that prosecutors later recast as proof of organized distribution of illegal proceeds. Two readings of the same dollar can lead to two different conclusions. In his world, care and control overlapped. The names around him will always command more space in popular memory, his brothers above all. And the underboss who flipped and moved west, he moved differently. He preferred quiet rooms, short sentences, and edges of photographs. Yet that very preference made him indispensable when an organization valued survival over spectacle. He lasted precisely because he didn't seek applause. Ironically, that steadiness also made it easier to trace his influence. Habit leaves a track. Agents walked it with patience. Jurors followed it with maps in their hands. The result is the record that defines him. He is not the sum of any one label. He was a city worker who handled hard labor and early mornings for a living wage. He was a brother who kept family close even when the world watched from across the street. He was a manager who turned timing into leverage across gambling, lending, docks, and businesses that needed calm. He was, in the eyes of the law, the leader of a criminal enterprise in its later years, responsible for extortion, racketeering, money laundering, and a conspiracy to find and harm a man whose testimony helped end the old era. All of those can be true at once, framed by different institutions with different aims. That plurality is part of what makes his story a neat, if sobering, sketch of how a big city's underground and overground touch. A final image sits with the people who knew him. A man stepping out of a diner before dawn, hat pulled low, scanning a block, not because he expected fireworks, but because he had learned to see small, tells a van that didn't belong, a person reading a paper without turning a page, a new scratch on a payphone. That scan taught him to avoid trouble for years. It also taught others how to follow him. In the end, both lessons held. He kept things orderly long enough to matter. And when the order was mapped, the map led straight back to him. What he leaves behind fits into a few sentences that don't carry flair. Born in the Bronx in 1939, oldest son in a crowded household, he learned to value timing and quiet. He worked for the city, then stepped into a deeper role within the Gambino family as a driver, guard, and eventually, a coordinator who became the person others looked to for decisions. He oversaw cash streams from betting and loans, steered influence at ports and in certain workplaces, and washed proceeds through consulting fronts. He was convicted twice in federal court on charges that gathered those acts into a continuing enterprise and included a plot to track a former underboss. He served most of his sentence and died in federal custody in 2021. You can argue about whether he wanted the top job or simply took it when no one else could. You can debate the degree to which his choices were carved by loyalty or by opportunity. But the record says he accepted responsibility for a system that enriched his circle by leaning on others in ways the law forbids. He kept the machine smooth. The machine kept him until it stopped, and then the court kept him. That's the line from a Bronx childhood to a hospital bed in a prison, drawn without exaggeration, named by juries, and now finished. And so ends the story of Peter Gotti, a man caught between loyalty and destiny, who carried the Gotti name long after the spotlight faded. In the end, even the strongest empires fall silent, but their echoes linger through time, whispering of power, family, and the price of both. If this story helped you drift through the night, leave a like. It truly motivates us to keep sharing these forgotten legends. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the underworld, told in the quiet of the night. Sleep well, my friend, and may your dreams stay peaceful, even in the empire's shadow.